actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do it like this. I was trying to think, how am I going to do this where I go live and then show you my cool intro? But if I don't show you the cool intro after talking, then 0 people will be here, because when you start a live, it's always 0 until everybody shows up and catches up. So we'll do it that way. So welcome. We have Richard Rierson on today. I'm going to hit this button. But first, backpack. There you go. That's my new backpack intro, because I just did that.
Love it.
Richard joins me. Richard Rierson. How the heck are you, Mr. Dose of Leadership yourself? How are you?
I'm doing good, man. It's good to finally talk to you again. I've always obviously see you every day on Facebook, but had you on the show a couple of times over the past 8 years, and it's just been good to I thought, man, I want to catch up and talk with him, man, because I always enjoyed my conversations with you.
I love it. And so the show that you just kind of casually mentioned is Dose of Leadership, which is a show that only a guy who could serve in the Marine Corps and also fly commercial airplanes for a living could do. You are at or around 400 episodes of that show. What the heck? Why didn't you quit?
Oh, man, I love doing it. I love the long form conversation, and when I set out to do Dose of Leadership, it was how can I get more notice in a noisy world and try to get more speaking gigs? And it didn't go any deeper than that, And so I went into it thinking, okay, if I have these conversations with these, I did a search on like how many leadership books are coming out. And I looked at my desk, and I'm a prolific reader, and all those leadership books. And I thought, how cool would it be to talk to all those people on my bookshelf? And then I did a Google search, and of course, leadership books there are tons of them.
Millions.
And then I sent out, I think that day, I don't know if I ever told you this story, but I launched, it was December 17th. It was December 17th, 2011. Yeah. And because I had built a website, and I was like, and I was naively thought, you build it, they will come, and
totally.
I learned how to build a website, and I was proud of myself, and it looked great, and I'm getting like 8 people to visit my website. I'm like, what do I got to do here? And so, learned all about, how to create an audience and lead generation. And then it just wasn't happening. And I thought, well, what if I did a podcast? And it was December 17th. And I had that thought, and I emailed 70 plus people. I just looked at authors, people on my bookshelf. And at the end of the day, by that evening, I had 3 people that said yes. And I couldn't believe that they said yes. And I was like, okay, I can't let these people down. And I launched the show on January. I did my first interview on January 6th. That was December 17th, ordered podcast equipment. John Lee Dumas and Andrew Warner from Mixergy. I emailed those guys, and both those guys, like 2 days after that, they each spent an hour and a half on the phone with me, just talking and telling me what I need to do. And then I Cliff Ravenscraft, which I never talked to, but
you knew from around.
Yeah, followed his advice and ordered equipment and did my first interview on January 6th, and I launched it on January 23rd. So 4 weeks later, I launched it. And I didn't quit because it was so much fun, and I started building a network that I didn't even think was possible. I mean, that's the thing about the power of podcasting and do all this. I've created a network that is beyond my wildest imagination, and it happened so fast. And you couldn't have done it the traditional way. It would take you years to build up the network that I've built up.
And then you threw it together. And now, now you get the adulation of people like my favorite Jeff Brown, Read to Lead podcast, who says, love that guy when I mentioned you're coming on the show. Jeff
Brown's great. He's awesome. He's been like a private mentor to me. I mean, he's got an amazing interview style. I rob, steal, and borrow from him by listening to him and how he does it. I owe a lot to Jeff. I never think I've ever told him that, but
well, you better tell him that. What happens. You don't get. Alice Fuller taught us you don't give people their flowers after they're dead.
That's true. I mean, and Jeff and I need to have Jeff on my show because
yeah, you do.
He's and we've talked back and forth. Of course, we're Facebook friends, and we talk and we communicate. And I'm a big supporter of him, and his podcast is fantastic. He's a great interviewer.
Do it on a hot mic. Listen, I got a question for you. You are nearing or just past 400 shows. We're not sure, either of us. Mm-hmm. What's the difference? What's a quick tip you've learned now, several hundred episodes later? Now you're an absolute professional interviewer, as well as a Marine veteran and commercial airline pilot, also podcast host. What have you learned?
Man, it's a great question. I think probably the biggest thing that I've learned, and when people have asked me, is like, what's your biggest takeaway from doing the show? Personally, it was the fact that we're all dealing with limiting beliefs, and we all got voices in our head, no matter how successful anybody is. I've had Barbara Corcoran, I've had Steve Forbes. They've all told me, like, it never goes away. Barbara Corcoran says she'll be in a deal that's going sideways, and she doesn't feel like she's in the right space. And she goes back to the little voice thing. You're just a dumb fourth grader that can't make any more than a D today, this day. And Steve Forbes said the same thing to me. He said, he woke up in the morning and he felt like, man, if the people only knew how unconfident I am about this deal, they would laugh me out of the room. And that was a revelation for me, because it's like, wow, okay, so I'm no different than Steve Forbes, except for the numbers in our bank account. So that was a relief for me. It was an aha moment, and I've carried it forward in my coaching and in my personal life, that, hey, everybody's struggling with the same thing, so let's just get on with it. So let's slay dragons. If everybody's got to slay the slain dragons every day, let's just, instead of trying to make the dragons go away, let's just become dragon slayers, right? And look forward to the killing of the dragons every day that we all got to face. So that was probably the biggest lesson I learned.
So I have friends in all of the various armed forces, even Coast Guard. I always say that with a joking face because of my pal Ben, because who doesn't make fun of the Coast Guard? But the Marines have a special place in my heart, and they do because a couple different things. One is that when I worked in wireless telecom, we had a couple Navy guys and we had a couple Marine guys and we had one Army guy. And the only two that we could always send on any kind of a job, they were field service engineers. So we'd fly them out to various places, then they'd have to build wireless telecom nodes in sort of like really crappy parts of town in a really small kind of closet. And the only thing was, with a Marine, when we sent them out, there was never a call back like, hey, what do we do about this? Or, hey, we ran out of twist ties, or, hey, anything. You could go out to that site. There might be pieces of hair stuck out of parts of that gear from where they clipped their own head off by mistake, doing something. They're not a comment. You know what I mean? They just took it. They did. Marines are used to not having any gear. They're the most Spartan of the military, which is, they get made fun of for, like, the other teams have like drones now, and the other teams have like, personal drones that fly around doing selfies for them. And really all you get is like some erasers that you could throw at each other if you're mad. And then from that into commercial airline, you've learned how to make do. You've learned so many times when you don't really have the resources. So what are your leaders, when you interview these leaders, what do they teach you about that? What do they teach you about the distance between make do and not whining about it and really leading? Because like Deborah says, we got to talk about slaying some dragons today, Richard.
Yeah, no, I mean, you hit some great points. And again, things that became crystal clear to me, or at least I took for granted while I was in the Marine Corps for those 10 years, but it was kind of the culture that was drummed into you, and part of it by necessity, because you were on the short end of the stick from budget. And to be quite honest, sometimes you had even people that kind of relished in the fact that we're doing more with less. And so there's a fine line to making people suffer and trying to prove that you can do more with less. But it is ingrained in the culture that, wow, you got to go out there and try to make do, and there's no sense in bitching and whining about it. The other part of it is to answer your question, is that and I learned this when I got away from the Marine Corps, that it was big about the intent. Like, if I know what the intent is, like what you want me to do, like what is your outcome that you want? And you're kind of trained to ask that if you don't get it. And so to your point, when, you want to send somebody out and they didn't come back to you and ask, what do you want me to do here? Is because they probably were trained to get what's the overall intent, what's the overall outcome. And if I know that, then leave me alone and I'll go get it done. And so when I talk to, and that's kind of, when I do my coaching and when I've been inserted as a consultant, I love to do that and kind of be an arrow in some company, their company's quiver. And that's what I try to do is I try to get people to, there's two parts, the senior leaders to kind of maniacally focus on the intent. Like if I'm going to tell you what I want to accomplish and why, and then the middle and below to, if they're not getting it, have the courage to ask for it. But then when you get it, to just go ahead and execute it. So leave the how up to the middle and below, and the senior leaders focus on the what you want to accomplish. And that's the big takeaway that I think a lot of leaders, a lot of CEOs, a lot of people I've had on my show, the ones that get it, the ones that have sustainable legacies and sustainable operations and efficient operations, and the ones that are going to be around a long time, they understand that concept. They may not talk about it in the military terms of intent, but they understand that concept that it's my job as a senior leader to communicate, and I say maniacally communicate what we want to accomplish and why. And if you can get that, and particularly entrepreneurs, I love talking with entrepreneurs who, when they're scaling, they have to do everything, and it's all about the entrepreneur. But at some point, they're going to have to start building that team and creating that division where I'm going to maniacally communicate what we want to accomplish and why, which you can't over communicate, by the way. And then the middle and below starts focusing on the execution piece of it. And I think so many of my conversations on my show have gone around that concept. And the great successful CEOs and leaders I've had, they embrace that decentralized leadership, that decentralized leadership philosophy of where everybody's taught to think and act like a leader. They may not express it in those terms, but that's what's happening, that everybody's a leader and decisions are made at the lowest level possible. Those are the great organizations. The dysfunctional ones are where everything's got to funnel up to the top, and the top guys it's all got to flow through me, right. And that's stagnation and mediocrity. And that's what we want to avoid.
There's a fighting leader. His name was Michael Tyson. I think he said everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So he's a good guy to think about with regards to that. And the reason I say this, because we're talking decentralized leadership, I feel, Richard, and I want to hear your stand on this. I feel that COVID, for as many bad things that it has done, has been an amazing wake-up call for leadership. I think a lot of leaders were kind of leader in name only, Linos. And they were really, button chair bosses, right? If they're in the chair, they're doing their thing. That's changed now. So you were so right. Comms, shoot, move, communicate, right? You got to keep moving, got to keep talking. What have leaders now realized, or should realize, or need to come back and watch a lot of your past episodes to pick up better now that they're learning about what remote teams are like and how extra decentralized we're going to have to be?
Well, I think by far, it's highlighted what I just talked about, is the importance of communicating, and that sounds kind of vanilla, but the more that as a senior leader, you can realize, you got to be maniacal about it. And I love that word maniacal, because it's like, it's an insane amount of intentionality to communicate what we're doing and why. And it's like every aspect of your community. You can't be an automaton robot and just be like spouting off phrases and your mission statement all the time. But it's like every communication has to somehow point back to what, because everything should be a litmus test. Is like, is this part of who we are? Why are we doing this?
We, as leaders and as operators, there's always that opportunity to accidentally go too far, to take a liberty. And we see many examples of that. And I think that the challenge is how do you build those gun rails? I love the book It's Your Ship, and I know you read leadership books. You probably read it.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Captain Abershoff. Sorry.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What's your kind of correction system for that sort of a thing?
Wow. Well, I think first and foremost, a lot of it where I see where the corrections don't get it. It's you got to let your ego go, right? You got to be willing to make. I see this too often, and from aviation, I think a lot of times people think that you don't have any room for mistakes, and that's so true. They just can't be fatal mistakes, and so I don't worry about so much. I try not to make any mistakes,
Sure.
but I just focus on not making the fatal ones. Don't run out of gas. Don't crash into a mountain. All that kind of stupid stuff, right? And where I see like bad pilots, just like I see bad CEOs, they try to make everything so perfect. And I'm like, man, just don't worry about the fate. Focus on not making fatal mistakes and let everything else. They try to make these linear. I hate the phrase. I love it when a plan comes together. I hate it because that denotes this
crapping on Hannibal?
Linear, right? This linear kind of path towards success or the objective. And when in reality, the path is kind of like this, and it just goes up and down and back and then, but it's more rapid than this, right? So the guy that's trugging along and trying to get granular in his plans and all those other things, I'd rather have this guy, right? Because he meets the objective. This guy probably hardly ever reached the objective because when something goes haywire, he stops and we got to re-baseline and do everything else and plan even harder, more detail in the plan. And that's the enemy. The detail's the enemy. And so I think that what people have to do, how do you correct, is that you got to let that go. You got to let that perfection go. You can pursue it. You can always pursue perfection. And what was that Lombardi quote? And then in the process will achieve greatness or something like that, right? But I think it's the ones like how do you recorrect or make sure that those gun walls or what'd you say? How do you make sure that those
that sort of thing? Just making sure that there's kind of guardrails on everything.
Right. You just make sure that you're defining the sandbox and where everybody can play and have people push the edges of the sandbox and tell them, don't bother me unless you need to expand your sandbox or you're running out of sand. Otherwise, go do what I told you to, carry out my intent.
I said to do until you're ready to do that next move. By the way, we have accidentally lured in here one of the most famous wine entrepreneurs in the world. Paul has, the wine of the month. He's done all this stuff. He has sampled thousands of vintages over time. So you draw some interesting people to me, Richard. Paul doesn't just wander in for any old person.
Well, thank you, Paul.
By the way, as you and I were talking about before we even got this thing launched up, you had some interesting timing. You left the Marine Corps after about 10 years active duty. You left just in time to not be in the middle of one of the most interesting conflicts in the world.
Yeah.
In time to become a commercial airline pilot, finishing up your training right before September 11th. This means that personal leadership was important to you because even though I'm making it into a joke, 100,000, I said 1,000. So sorry, Paul. Because that's how many people, 6 figures worth of wine in your mouth. Your timing obviously, was interesting, just how it worked. And you had to correct, life happens, man plans, God laughs, right? What did you do? What's Richard's I got myself out of the hole story for that?
Wow. When I go flying today and I'm back at American Airlines and I'm flying 787s internationally. And when I fly, it's like you always show up and you meet you don't know who you're flying with for the most part. Sometimes you fly as time goes on, but it's like, it's a new person and everybody tells their story. And I tell them where I finished my training on September 8th, 2001, last check ride, and September 11th, my first assignment, and furloughed October 1st. And everybody's like, oh, how horrible. And it was scary. And at the time, and I remember the mindset was at the time, oh my God, what am I going to do? All I know how to do is fly airplanes. That was my mindset. And when I got thrust into the corporate arena, the blessing that I found is that, when I was away from the Marine Corps and I wasn't flying. So I had to pivot. And I took a job as a shipping supervisor at a local manufacturer here. And it was during that time I started realizing all the lessons that I learned about being an officer in the Marine Corps and flying multi-crew aircraft.
Right.
Those skill sets helped me tremendously in the real world. And I took it for granted because I was around the same bunch of knuckleheads and everybody thought like I did. And we had the same similar training. And I just figured that's how the world operated. And I found out when I got out of it that it wasn't. And so I just kind of grasped that knowledge. And as it came to me, it's like, wow, I did learn a lot here. And I can make an impact here. And I just started adding value. And if you looked at my resume and the time that I was out, not flying, it doesn't line up. It's like, what are you going to be when you grow up? A shipping supervisor. I did land entitlement for a hotel company. I was a VP of communications for a hotel company. I was a VP of ops for a hotel company. I went to Bombardier and ran a bunch of project managers, and it was just different. But the thread, the common thread of all of those was the leadership skills, the common sense leadership skills that I learned as an officer in the Marine Corps and as an aircraft commander captain, as a pilot. And those skills translated well to the real world, meaning, communication, keeping things concise and decentralizing decision-making. And I found, I assumed if you were an organization that was a multi-million-dollar organization, you understood those concepts. And I found that that's not true. It's the rarity, actually. We're still bought into this kind of, Frederick Winslow Taylor hierarchical command, separate management and labor. And I hate it. And the Marine Corps was so anti that. The Marine Corps was so, eyes on the enemy, eyes on the customer, can equate that, make a decision and I'll support it. And it's foreign in the business community, in a lot of aspects. And so,
to me, the thing I've always thought about, again, that separates Marines, besides their Spartan supply system, is everyone's a rifleman first.
Right.
Anybody, you're a typewriter person, whatever, you're a rifleman. So that sort of notion that we're all sort of from the same cloth is a vital part of this whole thing. I want to ask you a question as it relates to that. In a way. Are you Midwestern born and raised? Like, are you from Kansas?
From Kansas, born and raised in Wichita, and I live here now. But yeah,
never left. That's it. That's where I need to be. I've been all over the world. Kansas is it. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I lived 10 years. I lived in the Marine Corps. I lived on the West Coast. I lived in Southern California. Yeah. You get kind of moved around as needs be in these kinds of moments. Do you we're not Midwestern people are never ever accused of being especially self-promotional. Marines are kind of dissuaded from being self-promotional. Pilots don't get a chance to be all that self-promotional. In fact, it weirds people out if you talk too much from that cockpit. Yeah, right.
How did you become the host of a podcast, and what's the hardest part about really talking yourself up? Because you're not on this side of the mic all that often, but how have you grown in that? And tell me a little bit about that.
I don't. Yeah, it is. I guess it is kind of weird. I mean, I think everybody has a little bit of narcissist in them, a little bit. I try not to think that I am, but I mean, I think I went through phases of. But I think it was more the entrepreneurial journey or the online journey. It was less more about. I think the thing I suffered from
the question, and it's locked you up a little.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it was uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable to hear myself, to listen back.
Sure.
It was scary to put things out there and think, oh my God, is anybody gonna like this?
Yeah.
But I think after I've had a lot of artists on the show. My daughter's an artist, one of them, and I think, and I'm a big fan of the arts. I think I've morphed in the last 8 years into more of the power of arts and the courage of putting things out there. I guess to your point, to get to your question, I think that it was scary as hell to put out there because and I'd get some great feedback early on. From people, from guests, from everybody. But then I'd see one critic. Oh, you're too boring, or you talk too much, or whatever. And it would like destroy me, for forever.
The worst.
And I still struggle with that a little bit, but I think I've just come to think, hey, it's about, when I started framing it, to answer your question, when I started framing it that it takes courage to do this, I mean, as silly as that may sound, but it helped me because I like those kind of images, right, of being courageous. And courageous meaning you're still scared to death, but then you go ahead and do it anyway, and you work through that. Something significant happens on the other side, right? I mean, that's what I tell my kids. It's what I coach people on when I coach CEOs and everything else. I'm always, and other people, like, what does it mean to be courageous? I think that's how I dealt with it. And I just internally, pump myself up by saying, who cares? I mean, am I adding value? And I asked that question, why am I doing this? Am I doing this to pump up my ego? And I think probably sometimes I would look for the great reviews to get validation. It's kind of the same thing. I don't know if you did this, if you give keynotes, right? You give
Sure,
speeches and stuff. Yeah. Have you ever got done with a keynote and you looked for that validation for people to come up and tell you it was great?
Only time I do it. Like only everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And I found I had a great teacher, a great mentor, and she's since passed away, but she was actually an acting coach, and she helped me here locally. She went through the Lee Strasberg method up in New York City. She helped me with my speeches and my keynotes. This is like 10 years ago. And she told me one time, she said, and she saw me kind of seeking that validation after the keynotes. And she said, once you get it out there and you let it go, and when somebody comes up to you and say, "Oh, Richard, that was so awesome," you just take it as that gift, and then you let it go, right? And you let it go. And and so what my point of this is that I think it's there for a time, and I think that's where I kind of got sideways, this is 10, 12 years ago. And it would bother me. I was seeking that validation because I was seeking the keynote or the feedback to kind of validate my existence. Does that make sense? And
very much so.
And I got rid of that a long time ago. And it's helped me with the podcast. And it's kind of my long answer to get to what you originally asked, is that I catch myself up. I see, why am I doing it and what am I seeking it for? And I don't do it for my validation. And I've long since ago said, I'm doing this because I want to add value. And I don't expect anything in return. And that's how I do it. I do it because and there have been times it's been low. So I'll be honest, I'll be sitting there, I'll be like, God, is anybody even listening to this? I can see the downloads and I can see that,
where are they all?
How come I'm not getting any? And then out of the blue, I'll get an email, like the universe. And this is just weird. I don't know how it happens, but every time I've been low like that and feeling all kind of down and like, what's the point? I'm not going to do this crap anymore. Nobody's even listening. And then I got this email from this guy from South Africa. And he's like, "Hey, I just want to send you a quick email. I've been listening to your show for 4 years. I love it. Every Wednesday, me and my team, we stay late, we get a pizza, and we listen to your show, and we discuss the topics on your show." And I was like, what? And that just blows me away. That it doesn't pay that doesn't pay the electric bill.
No,
but it certainly fuels the emotional tank on why I do this. Right? Does that make sense?
It does. I'm gonna dive in on that though too, because Deborah Linehan just made a comment that really lines up with me. So I figured this out reasonably well at 2012. It took me a long time to get there, and it was related to converting to Buddhism, which you get to stay whatever religion you are. You could be anybody. You could be
right,
Jewish, Buddhist, or whatever, because it's just a process. It's not. You don't have to pray to any particular guy, because the Buddha said, "Don't even pray to me." That's a stupid idea. So Deborah says what I do, which is basically, if we can appreciate and let go of the praise, we get stronger at accepting and letting go of the criticism. So what happens is neither criticism nor praise is a valuable tool to you. They both have a caustic, acidic kind of feeling to them.
Right.
And what happens if we operate seeking praise, then we veer from our destination and we kind of try to please people. And unfortunately, what we tend to please are the people who are most have the most volume, who are almost never our real buyer. Our buyers are always quiet.
Yeah, for sure.
Our buyers are always quiet. So I also had to give away criticism for Lent. That's a Christian faith thing, but Catholic anyway. I had to give away criticism for Lent because it turned out that most of the people criticizing me weren't my buyer either. And I'm like, I don't have any of your money in my wallet. I don't think I need to know what you think about me. I'm okay. I have very few people on this planet who get a free pass to criticize me. So Chloe says, I think one of the biggest ways that we can trip up is getting caught in the need for that validation.
For sure.
No
for
question.
sure.
And I think it's as leadership goes, I mean, I suppose if you were coaching people, you probably wouldn't coach them to seek any validation, would you?
No. I think the biggest lie that we all face, and this is for everybody, but particularly leaders, is that the biggest lie and the biggest myth, and we're all guilty of this, is that we think that, success equals what we accomplish and what other people think about us. And I just described 99.9% of the human race at some point in their lives. And I know that almost destroyed my life, where it almost led to divorce because I was so focused on, because when I got laid off from American Airlines and I had my dream job, I identified myself as a pilot. I identified myself as a Marine Corps officer. I wanted you to know that I was those things.
Right.
Because I was identifying my role as who I was and not looking at it as a role, if that makes sense. Right. I'm not a pilot. I am not a Marine Corps officer. I am. I played that role. I played that role as a Marine Corps officer. I play the role as a father right now. But my role as a father for my 23-year-old is different as my role as a father when she was 6 months old, right? And I think it's the same thing when I looked at being a pilot or being whatever. I identified my self-worth was based on, at the time, what I accomplished and what other people thought about me. And I think that's the biggest sin and the biggest lie that we get ourselves wrapped up in, because it leads to what you said, is we start seeking that validation or that approval to validate ourselves. And that's where people get lost. And so you got to somehow seek that validation through somewhere else. And it ain't through your job title, your position, or even what you accomplish. And that is difficult for people to wrap around, but that is central, I think, to great leadership, because it isn't about all that stuff that we're seeking and we're chasing. You will get overflowing in abundance if you selflessly add value to everything that you do. That makes sense.
Absolutely. It's interesting. One verbal thing I've heard you do a bunch of times, and this is, if that makes sense. When you say that to me, and I don't mean to like flip the spotlight on and wicked zoom in on your head, but look, I just push this button and I'm zoomed in on your head. When you say, if that makes sense, do you worry that you're very far afield from other people's ideas? Do you find yourself thinking that maybe your view of the world is askance in some way? And I ask that question because as you're a leader and as you're sort of teaching leadership and all that, I think part of that is sort of self-calibration. Do leaders look at themselves and look at their belly buttons a lot more than other people do for a reason? And do you find yourself doing that?
Yeah, I definitely do myself. I think a lot of that, the phrases like, you know what I mean, or if that makes sense, comes from a place of lack and scarcity in myself, right? I mean, I think a huge part of leadership development that I didn't realize, I think a lot of times, even doing this, and I spoke and taught and coached leadership even before Dose of Leadership for sure, but I think the 8 year, talking to 400 people has been very therapeutic for me. I mean, I think my show has probably given me more value and changed me internally more than people realize, right? And so I think a lot of times the internal or the game of leadership, it's a lifelong pursuit. I think 80 to 90% of it is your constant self-awareness and self-improvement. And I used to think it was more external. Like, okay, I got to go motivate Chris Brogan today. He's my subordinate. I need to motivate him. And that's just, I can't motivate you. You got to motivate yourself. The best I can do is continually work on myself and shine the spotlight on myself in an authentic and transparent way. And by you seeing that spotlight on me, and this isn't a narcissist spotlight, this is a self-awareness. I'm just what I'm working on. And you see that, then that gives you the freedom to do the same if you and I are working together. And so, yeah, I think that, me saying, if that makes sense, I don't know if I do feel like it's, sometimes I feel like that I'm not understood, or the concepts I'm talking about are not well embraced. because I think every organization that I've worked in, every organization that I've coached, every organization that I've done a keynote in, there's a level of dysfunction there that is around this concept of leadership or lack thereof. And I think that we think we know what it means, but when you start asking people what is leadership, I mean, they start saying it's position, it's title, it's, the guy or gal in charge and taking the hill. And I'm like, it's a dirty, selfless, grimy, long haul, thankless grind that has the potential for tremendous payoff. If that makes sense, there I said, if that makes sense.
There it is again.
You get me. But
Deborah asked, is that because you're making sure people are picking up what you're laying down? Because I think you are. You're kind of course correcting a lot of other people's understanding of terms that they may be using differently than you. Does that feel accurate when you hear it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the fact that, a lot of it is, my brain moves faster than I've gotten better at it. But I mean, I'm probably have my daughters think I have ADHD in some, because I do. I mean, my mind, everybody's mind is like, what is that? The drunk monkey double fisting, and then I see a squirrel or whatever. So it takes me a lot to articulate my thoughts, and I do a lot of half sentences and pauses and stops, and I've gotten better at it. But I think that's why I probably do it. It's a lack of confidence sometimes that I'm understood.
400 episodes, Richard. I mean, that's not a fluke at that point, right? I mean, you can't fake it for 400 episodes. You can probably fake it for a
no.
Can't fake it.
I've definitely gotten. You know what it is though? It's just I bury in myself, and that's why I love audio podcasting. By the way, because when you saw me, I'm like buried into my mic. I'm like this, like I'm holding my head, and I got earphones on, headphones on, and I'm just like, and I can almost see. That's the point. Like if I was doing an audio with you, I could see your facial expressions, if that makes sense. Yeah. And like I can hear like breaths, and I can hear things, and it's made me more attuned to, and that's why I love audio.
Yeah. That's what Carrie Gorgon and I and Andrew Warner and Jeff Brown and I did a panel together that I just kind of made up on the fly one night when I wanted to. And Jeff said he can't stand when guests can see him, and he doesn't want
right.
to do the video thing because he doesn't want him to have any more to work with than what the audio listener's going to get. And so we joked, of course, that Jeff only interviews blind people so that they can't see him. But then, I think there's a comfort, right? There's a comfort in audio because then you don't have to focus. I mean, this extracts energy. You're an introvert. It extracts energy. Yeah. I am an introvert. Yeah. Every minute of screen time is about a minute and a half or more of lifetime in my life. You know what I mean? Like I feel it after. I'm like, I could go for a nap right about now.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
So I think there's that. When do you think you will accept that you have made it?
Oh man, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm very leery of that, of ever saying I've made it. I think it's very dangerous for leaders particularly to sit there and go, I've made it, and they plant the flag and they got the corner office and they put their feet up on the desk and they feel this sense of accomplishment, which again, I'm not trying to take away the accomplishment. You can feel proud about that, but to kind of plant the flag and say I've made it, I think that's a dangerous place to be, because the next thing that usually happens is some sort of a fall.
Pride. I think we heard that one from somewhere.
Yeah. And so I'm never a big fan of planting flags and saying I've done it, I've accomplished it, I've arrived, because man, there's so much to learn. The more that you dive into something, the more that you're like, man, I don't know shit.
I'm not laughing at you right now, Richard, but would you just tilt your head straight down for a minute when you say you're not a big fan of planting flags? Tilt it more.
Yep. Yeah. The ultimate planting the flag, right?
The ultimate flag plant in the history of humanity, except for maybe the moon, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. You could argue that one. I think that one's more important. But that's
a pretty big one. But even then, if you study like, if you study the various guys behind there and what their stories were, it wasn't over for them,
Yeah,
Like
you're right. That's not the end.
battle was the battle went on for another, 28 days after that, and a lot more blood and sacrifice and toil. So yeah, and nothing wrong with playing. There's nothing wrong with saying, "Hey, here I am. I've accomplished this. I'm proud of this." It's kind of like a base camp thing. If you're climbing that unending mountain, right? You get to the base camp, you can celebrate. You can put our arms around each other. You can pop open a cold one and look what we've done, Chris. Isn't this awesome? And then we look at the peak and we're like, well, guess where we're going tomorrow, and we're going to start. This
is my favorite minute of this show. Just so you know, Richard, this minute you just gave, this is my favorite. You lit up and felt yourself in a good way. And I feel like you just really conveyed a piece of really juicy meat right there. It's interesting. I mean, you never know when it's going to hit, right? Sometimes it's the beginning of your show. Sometimes it's all downhill after the best thing you could possibly say at the time.
Right, well, hopefully it's not just downhill from
No, not even a little bit. It's just we're, like you just said it while you were doing it. You were like, yeah, well, we just made it this peak. Well, we're going up another, false, what do they call that? False mantle or whatever. When you think you've hit the summit, false summits, it's the worst. Listen, what, you've read a billion books at this point. Now you read for love. I haven't read a single book since this quarantine, partly because I'm writing a book and I don't mix those streams, but partly because the quarantine. I'm just not into it. Like I
get it. I understand it. I get it.
What are a few books of late that you absolutely would stick in the backpack of someone looking to get better at leadership?
Well, I think, and I go to this, I think it's a go-to, but Stephen Pressfield's The War of Art, not Sun Tzu's The Art of War, but Stephen Pressfield's The War of Art is an absolute go-to, and it's been a game changer for me personally. And when I coach people, when I enter into a coaching relationship, a personal one-on-one coaching relationship, I have them read that book before. It's an easy book to read. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but
very.
But it's an easy read. You can read it in one sitting, in one night, but the concepts in it are just mind blowing, and they're foundational to who I am today as a man, as a leader, as a citizen of the community, of the world. I think it's essential that you embrace those concepts in The War of Art. I think it's almost like a Bible for me. And so that would definitely be in my backpack, because it talks about everything we've kind of hit on here about, embracing the dragons. He talks about resistance, right? That the resistance is real. If the angels, the muse, the universe puts something on my heart and I'm here and, it just seems impossible. That gap between where you want to be and where you feel you're at right now, that gap is real. It's the resistance, and it'll try to kill you. It will figuratively and literally try to kill you. And I love that mental image in my head, and it keeps me going. And I think that is the foundation of leadership. If you can embrace those concepts and realize that it's the slaying dragon thing. I mean, he even talks about it as dragons in that book, it's slaying the dragons.
He does. Richard Rierson, I'm kicking you out right here. I think this is the right time for this. I think that we hit the good stuff, and I think we're going to go right here and now. You, sir, are a wonderful man. Like I have pointed out more than a couple of times during this thing, we can follow you on the tweeters at Dose of Leader. Do not add ship. Do not stop at lead. You can go to doseofleadership.com and check out over perhaps 400 episodes of a podcast that Richard has built around the concept of leadership, a perfect thing to have in our backpack. The tools today: be decentralized, communicate, be humble, be willing to throw away praise and criticism. Richard, thank you so much for being on this show today.
Chris, you're a gem. You're a true friend, and I've loved. You've been on my show twice. Thanks for having me on your show. And again,
all you get once, so that's it. You're already getting over me.
Right. No, but I'm glad you're in my circle, and I'm glad what you do. And again, I think you add value to the universe, and you're a great man. I appreciate you having me come on your show.
Thank you, man. Much love to you. We'll talk to you really soon. Everybody else, you know what time it is. Get off my lawn. Get out of here.